Well, on that now, let's bring in Liberal MP Tim Wilson. Tim, good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. We spoke so much about Hong Kong last year. Now, there was a period of relative peace and now it's come surging back. How much of a concern is that for you and also China's involvement in that?
Well, it's deeply concerning. The reality is you have Hong Kong and you have millions of people who have a simple aspiration to be able to live their lives freely and without overbearing interference from Beijing. And what we've seen over the past 48 hours is Beijing turn around, implement a new national security law to justify interference directly into the affairs and to override the democratic processes that are in place. And, I think what Beijing politely is underestimated is that a lot of the people, and I've spoken to Josh Wong, who was just on your program just there, or being interviewed in that program just there, is that they feel like they have nothing to lose because either way, if Beijing gets their way, then they will suppress people's liberties and freedoms. So
this claim that it's to ban treason, sedition and subversion is just a ruse, to try and get into Hong Kong?
It's not a ruse. It's just that they'll interpret those terms very broadly. And so anybody who dissents, anybody who has a different opinion, everybody stands up and speaks out, anybody uses their freedom of speech to question, to challenge authority will fall under that parameter. This is one of the reasons why freedom of speech is so fundamental, because you actually need the freedom to speak out against tyranny or oppression or authoritarianism. And it's why it's a value that can't be compromised.
Does it increase China's capacity to do harm?
Well, I think let me wait and see how this, in practical application works out. But what we know is that terms like sedition and suppression and everything else can be very liberally used by Beijing as it sees fit, and as a consequence, you'll see suppression, I think.
Okay, well, still on China and closer to home, in fact, in your state of Victoria, Daniel Andrews is under fire for his links and his investments in the Belt and Road Initiative. What part of that vexes you?
Well, I think the part that vexes me personally is you have a state government going off and doing deals with foreign governments without consultation with the Commonwealth. That's my biggest criticism. But equally, the Belt and Road Initiative is obviously a plan to expand the influence and reach of China, and as part of its infrastructure program. And I think, our relations with foreign countries should primarily be resolved by the federal government. That's what the federal government's elected to do, and that's what should happen.
He says it's all about jobs. That's all this is about. I mean, is that worthy? Is that something that you're buying?
Well, if it's all about jobs, then he would have had no problem going through each step with the Commonwealth government, because that's the level of government. We care about jobs too. In fact, we have primary responsibility for the economy and our relationships with other countries. I think, frankly, that's just a ruse rather than actually, the reality is that this deal should have gone through proper processes and with the Commonwealth.
Well, I mean, is there a disconnect at the moment between the federal government and the Victorian state government? You've got the Andrews government is basically being openly critical of our government's push for an inquiry, and in return, that may have led to these extra tariffs that are being placed on barley. I mean, all's not well.
Well, I don't agree with the Victorian government narrative on this, but they'll be accountable to their own words. But in the end, the Commonwealth has responsibility for relationships with other countries, and when you come to a state government going behind effectively the Commonwealth's back to go and do deals with the government of China and the Chinese Communist Party, I think the public takes a pretty dim view, and I think they should take a pretty dim view because in the end it raises big questions about our sovereignty, about making sure that states do the proper thing by our country. And now they're trying to say it's all about jobs, I think, is a distraction from, frankly, a pretty questionable deal that they've done behind the Commonwealth's back.
What about these comments that the Secretary of State said on the weekend, Tim, that the US would disconnect from us? I mean, it was a hypothetical question that he was answering, but and the ambassador moved quickly to clarify that. But does it give you an idea of their thinking?
Well, it shows you that the United States feels strongly that, obviously they have alliance partners like Australia, and they expect us to work with them cooperatively. And we have, we had a decision around Huawei and their investment in our telecommunications network. There was a restriction on that because it wasn't deemed to be consistent with our national security obligations, particularly as part of our Five Eyes partnership with the United States, Canada, New Zealand and the United Kingdom. And so what they're saying, I think, and the US is flagging, is that they will obviously have to protect their own national security interests, and Australia should do the same.
And do you believe that there is a risk, there's a security risk with telecommunications infrastructure?
Well, I wasn't in the briefings when that decision was made, but the decision was made very clearly, and it was based on a number of factors, including very strongly national security advice. And so in this case, I trust our intelligence agencies.
Okay. Just on to economic matters, we're talking about the $60 billion bungle. It's been widely reported and dissected over the weekend, but I guess now is the time to think about what to do with that going forward. I mean, what's your view on this? Should we save it or should we spend it?
Well, I think it's quite straightforward. The fundamental difference between a Liberal government and a Labor government is when you get $60 billion $60 billion more of debt. A Liberal government says, we're not going to take on that debt. A Labor government would say, hey, we're going to go off and spend it frivolously without any regard. And so that's the fundamental dividing lines among many in politics. And so I think it's a pretty straightforward proposition. Let's not go further into debt. That's what the Treasurer's been saying and the Prime Minister's been saying, and I think that's 100% right.
There is the argument, though, that if you put that money out into the economy, that it gets injected, and so it increases cash flows. I mean, are you buying that at all?
Well, liquidity is not a problem in the Australian economy. This is what is the fundamental difference between the economic consequences of a health pandemic and an economic crisis. It didn't start as an economic crisis. It started as a health crisis that's had economic flow through. There's no fundamental problem of liquidity in the economy. There's plenty of cash. The challenge we've got is around businesses reopening, and then, of course, adjustments that are going to be made because of the legacy of a couple of months of shutdown. So simply pumping more money into an economy that can't do transactions isn't going to boost economic growth.
Okay, Tim Wilson, always good to get your thoughts. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.